If you've ever wanted a slider that truly has a wide open space and able to install it by yourself, well, keep on watching. Let's get started.
This project has certainly become the largest and most detail-oriented project I have taken on YouTube. It started from framing, of course, sheathing, roofing, siding, which did account for two different types of siding, whether that was our Hardie plank or the cedar deck boards that we turned into siding. But our Mira Vista door just landed, which means we can finally button up the exterior of this project.
Our door finally arrived and we can get it installed into our beautiful facility. Now, the one thing about this door is that it's unlike any door I've ever installed. It's an entirely large slider that goes from one side all the way to the other, and it's going to give this room not only that very aesthetic look, but also a wide open space for it to just feel a little bit more comfortable. So let's get this thing popped open and installed.
With any standard door installation system, you're going to have jambs. We have two jambs, which is going to be on the left and right, but those jambs are unique because we have a built-in metal side trim. Now, these trims are optional. You don't have to have these fully installed, but I figured we'd have them to showcase them since this is an option, and it is designed to repel water away from your structure, but I'm going to be using it in a more unique decorative fashion. We also have a heavy-duty sill plate along with a header, and once those are all busted open, we can now start laying them out appropriately. Now, you do have the option to have a left or right hand swing. In this application, we have a left hand, which means we're opening the door on our left side and moving the slider all the way to the right. Prior to assembly, you do want to remove all the weather stripping, which is definitely a very nice durable product, so you don't have to worry about it tearing while you're removing it. And once removed, we can start the assembly process. Our door jamb matches up perfectly with our header, and don't worry about if those metal trim pieces look slightly awkward because we do have a connection clip system that will be installed in the very near future. But before then, we need to get this casing screwed together. And luckily with this kit system, the screws themselves also come in the kit. They are 3 1 5/8 inch long screws, and each fastener location is already pre-indicated to where you're going to need to apply your screws in the first place. Once our entire door casing is assembled in all 4 corners, we can make our way to the top corners where we're going to be installing this plastic end cap, which basically just directs the water that comes and hits that channel if there is water and drops down into the metal channels on the side of our jambs. There's also a small black drainage plug that goes on the bottom of our sill, which also is a way for water to be filtered away from our structure if there is water that penetrates this area. Now, before we stand up our door casing, I did take a quick measurement to see how much space we had on both sides. I didn't have exact measurements when framing, so I am a little heavy, but we're able to account for that quite easily with the following.
So I made this opening just a little bit wider than it needed to be originally, just because I haven't worked with this door before, and therefore I wanted to guarantee we had plenty of extra space. We have space. We have about 1.5 inches of extra space. So what I'm going to do is apply a piece of excess plywood on both sides just to narrow up the overall depth factor and the opening space, so we can obviously use less shims in the long run. So let's get to cutting.
Now, I did eventually get the rough opening size, so if you don't want to do this step, you certainly don't have to. Just make sure that the opening size is 113 inches 5/32 by 81.5 inches. Now, I do place this plywood right over the top of our Tyvek house wrap, but that's also because I'm going over with another layer of flashing tape so we have extra protection and precaution over this area, since this is going to be the most water intrusive point of our entire structure. While you're doing this, you always want to think about the proper layering process, because the sides should always be done first before you get to the top, so you have the proper orientation between layer to layer. We're now finally able to lift our door casing and slide it snugly into position. Now, I obviously did assemble this framing on the interior of our structure, which did make it a little bit more difficult to slide out, but it was certainly a lot easier to assemble since we had nice flat and stable decking to work on versus lumpy grass, of course. And as you can see, perfectly snug fit the very first time. Now before we get to any shims and so forth, you do want to apply a nice bead of sealant across the top perimeter along with the sides to make sure that we have just a nice waterproof seal at this location. But with that accounted for, we can now move on to shimming this door. For the shims, especially at the base, I always use composite shims just in case there's any moisture intrusion issues. I do not want any of these shims to degrade over time. And just remember, when applying shims, you want a nice snug fit, but it doesn't have to be bulging out. So make sure you apply a couple love taps with a rubber mallet and you can move on to the next section. I do generally set the base first and then take a 6-foot level and plumb up one side of our door jamb. Once one side is accounted for, I can then make my way to the other side, shim that out, and make sure we are plumb on this side as well. Generally speaking, if you do have one side plumb, the other side should be plumb or at least very close to. Our top header should also be leveled out because since it's such a long span, that door casing is going to sag. So I do apply one nail at this location to make sure that we're nice and flat all the way across before we start double checking not only our levelness, but our plumbness throughout the entire perimeter. Take a bit of adjustments, of course, but now that I've got the top and bottom secured, take a look at that accuracy. Of course, let's just double check. Oh man, that looks good. We obviously also want to try and double check the front face to make sure that's as level as can be, since if this is not level either, then we're gonna have one hell of a time getting that door installed. But look at that. I mean, my goodness. After all that hard work we put in, sure is worth it, Kona, right? Woo! Now before we fully fasten our door casing to our framework, I do go all the way around and double check with a framing square or contractor square. You do want to do this because it is quite imperative that this structure is as close to square as possible since we have such a long span of doors. You may have to account for very slight adjustments one way or the other to perfectly square up our framing before we start fastening. At any hinge or door hardware locations, I do apply an ample amount of shims just to guarantee that those areas are going to stay consistent while we're screwing in the frame. But after all of our shims are in, I install these 2.5-inch long screws that do come with the hardware set at any location that's already pre-indicated. Now there are pre-indicators right at the hinge locations, but also around the perimeter, right where our weather stripping is going to hide these fasteners, which is going to be nice since we don't have to worry about concealing these fasteners when it's time for painting and finishing. With our casing fully secured, I make my way to our sill, and there is a sill cap that can be easily pried up off of our sill plate, and we can apply a few small screws at this location every 18 inches approximately. These screws are 1.5/8 inch long, and once installed, we can reinstall our sill cap in a nice snug fashion and move on to our doors.
We got our entire door casing fully installed, but now it comes to our doors. Now the doors themselves, there's 3 panels. Now these doors definitely have some quality weight to it, but certainly not super heavy to the point where you have to handle it with 2 people. If you have a second hand, I'd certainly asked for a hand, but because we're building this thing solo, it's by myself.
The first door you're going to need to grab during the installation process is the hinge side door. Now it is very easy to figure out which door is which because there's only one hinge side, one middle door, and of course the lock side door panel as well. Applying a couple shims at the base of the door always makes the lining up portion of our hinges much more easy in my perspective, so applying a couple shims may be a little bit of extra work, but it's certainly going to be a lot easier if you're not having to fumble around with the overall weight of the door because the shim's already there and have it perfectly positioned as you're installing the remaining screws. The first two door panels has this very nice sliding mechanism on both the top and bottom, basically just to secure the door to our sill plate as well as our header. Personally, the easiest way to find exactly where these holes need to be placed is to apply a small amount of paint on the rod, and that leaves a perfect imprint on where we need to drill our holes. At the base here, I drill a pilot hole first and then use a 5/16 inch bit and drill down approximately 3/4 of an inch, or at least that's where we want to be. With our hole drilled, we can now install our hinge bar pin, which is just this plastic cap that fits nicely into that hole, and then above we drill out a 3/8 inch hole that is also approximately 3/4 of an inch deep. This side gets a hinge bar pin reinforcement plate that just has 2 wood screws on both sides, very substantial, and once that's fully seated, we can double check to make sure everything lines up and it's as snug as can be the very first time, which is always nice. Prior to bringing over our second panel, you do want to apply a couple shims at this location because number one, you don't want to mar our sill plate, but two, you also want to have an easier time of lining up each door, which this will accommodate. The way the doors line up, there is a top and bottom knuckle, and between those two knuckles, there is a perfect hole for us to slide in a 1-inch long steel dowel. Now this steel dowel is actually a little difficult to get in, especially in this location because we're working against gravity and we're trying to push that pin up into the knuckle above. With some persistence, you're able to get it in, and once in, you take a thrust disc and attach that to a metal plug. Insert the metal plug into position, tighten down the screw here so it holds the metal rod in place, and we can move our way up to the top knuckles. Now this set is obviously much easier to install because we do have gravity on our side, so that metal rod slides much more easily in place, and once in place, we can then install our plug. Now we don't have to have a thrusting disc placed on the rod in this location because that's basically there to account for friction circumstances because that rod is going to be really driving into that disc on the lower knuckle section over time. With our 2 interior knuckles accounted for, we can make our way to the exterior knuckles. Now in order to install these properly, we need to remove them first along with any rubber or foam protective gaskets that are in any of these holes. Those are just there for protection, and then it's time to install our truck. Now these are basically just a really high-end stainless steel bearing wheel system which fits perfectly into our track on our sill, and then simultaneously we insert our knuckle on the top portion of our truck. We then reinstall the screws on this lower knuckle and make our way up to the top knuckle to do the same exact thing. The process of this installation is quite straightforward, but the one thing we do have to account for and think about when installing is after it's all installed, make sure that that truck is really seated nicely in the correct position in our track. You might have to do some slight adjustments with a crescent wrench or the wrench that's provided in the kit, but just know ahead of time there are going to be a few miscellaneous adjustments that are going to be needed through the installation process. With 2 doors down, we can now bring over our third and final door and lower that right on our sill plate, which still does have some shims already pre-arranged to make sure we have that spacing that we're going to need for proper installation. The same installation method still applies to this set of knuckles in comparison to the last two, because all we're doing is inserting that 1-inch metal rod first, then taking our thrust disc and our plug and inserting that into that opening. But as a reminder, that thrust disc does not need to be installed on the top portion of these knuckles. With the third door fully seated and installed, I removed the shims, made sure our door swing was looking good, which it was, and moved on to installing the second set of our hinge bar pin reinforcement plate that is screwed to the top of our header, but also then pounded in position at the base of our sill. With these installed, I can then double check my alignment to make sure that the rods are positioned correctly and fit into those plunge holes. And because they all do properly line up, I can install the hinge screw on the back side of the knuckle to secure our plug in place. With these last and final steps of this door being installed, I did want to take a special moment to say thank you to Endura for being the sponsor of this week's video. Now, they didn't pay me for this video, but they certainly provided this door for free, which I do greatly appreciate, and it is certainly built substantially well, which I am excited to be using for years to come. If you want to check out where to find a local dealer in your area, I'll make sure I have a link in the video description below. I tidied up the remaining door area by reinstalling our weather stripping around the entire perimeter, and with the weather stripping fully installed, we can now make our way to our siding. Because we have this beautiful door, we are now able to finish off our siding, but before we do that, we have to have a little bit of extra weatherproofing protection. As I mentioned previously, you are able to remove these pieces of metal trim on the sides of our door casing, but because I'm using them, I'm going to be incorporating them with our siding, I do want to apply one final layer of waterproofing protection with some seam tape at the transition point of where our metal trim meets our Tyvek house wrap. After that's applied around the entire perimeter of our doorway, I do take a measurement from end to end and add approximately 1/4 inch to that measurement. This is because we're applying a piece of drip edge flashing at the very top of our doorway in order to make sure that the vast majority of the moisture that hits our siding above our doorway is repelled away from the door once it gets to this metal drip edge flashing. It's placed right on top, making sure that the drip edge is overhanging the lip of the channel for our doorway, and once centered, we can start nailing it down and applying a final layer of flashing tape between that transition point of the metal and our Tyvek house wrap. As I was reviewing all transition points before we got to siding, I did notice that there is a small gap in between our metal flashing at the very base of our door and the metal trim with the door. In order to make sure that's not a weak point moving forward, I do apply a small secondary piece of metal flashing right here in order to guarantee that any moisture that hits this bottom section is going to be repelled away from our structure. For those of you who missed our last video, I did install Hardie plank on the lower section of this entire structure. Now this is more of a cementitious type material, which is nice in terms of small cuts because all you have to do is score it a couple times and apply a couple love taps and it should break off quite cleanly. Once ready for installation, I do grab my laser level and line it up with the very bottom of our lip on the opposite side. That means that we can accommodate the same stagger pattern to make sure that there's no unevenness as we work our way up from bottom to top. With these small sections, it is quite easy to get off kilter and out of alignment, so I do double check every single piece for levelness prior to installing my second nail, because I just want to guarantee that we have a nice cohesive look as we work our way up. These boards are 9¼ inches wide, and I'm trying to have the largest reveal possible, so I have an 8-inch reveal, and luckily I have a gecko guide that provides a perfect distance between each row, which not only saves me time, but it doesn't damage our siding whatsoever. The only caveat here with these small sections of siding is that we do have to still double check for our levelness, because in larger siding pieces we have 2 of these clamps which work off of each other to level it perfectly, but with this, one single one isn't enough and it can be easily off kilter 1/4 inch here or there, which definitely adds up quite a bit with the naked eye. All that to say, just keep a level on you to make sure it still looks good and consistent all the way up. Eventually we do get to a point where we're going to have a full piece of siding, so we do cut it down to size, which in this case is approximately 139 inches, and once cut to length, we have to account for the proper depth because our door is getting in the way. I account for the overall distance between our side trim and our metal flashing, then note that we have to have approximately 1.75 inches of space cut off at this location. Now I do the same exact thing on the opposite side of our Hardie plank and then run a string line all the way across. The only thing about this product though is that because it's cementitious, it is something that you do not want to breathe in, so just make sure you're wearing a proper respirator while cutting this material with your circular saw. You will also have to account for a plunge cut at this location, but that's pretty simple enough as long as you have some basic circular saw skills. With the ends trimmed up, we can move our piece of siding into place, and also know that because we're doing a full stretch, we can use these gecko grips on both sides and have a perfect consistent level all the way across. I do double check just in case, but it is perfectly level, which always feels good, especially when we get to this final few stages. Our piece of siding is nailed off all the way across, and then reposition our gecko grips and determine the final depth needed for this final piece. Again, if we did this right, it should line up perfectly with the distance that we did previously on the opposite two sides of our structure, which it does do, to approximate 1/8 of an inch. Our string line is snapped, our piece is cut, and as you can see vividly, you do not want to be sucking in any of this dust, so please make sure you wear a respirator when cutting this material. I did have to somewhat finagle this final piece of siding into position because I had to get underneath our drip edge on the top side, but I also had to get above our gecko grip on the bottom side. So I did have to maneuver it in a certain way, but inevitably we made it work and we're able to nail off this final piece and have a culmination to this entire siding exterior portion of our project. Firsthand, I really do love the functionality of this door. It's quite smooth and near effortless to reposition it back into position, which from my perspective is an extremely nice feature to have. This certainly was not the easiest door to install, which hopefully is the reason why they wanted me to do this video for you in the first place. And personally, my only concern when reviewing this door installation at this time is the fact that you might have to account for a little bit of a blowout or cleanup in our track system since it's exterior facing, and therefore there might be some debris that lands throughout the day or throughout the weeks. But with that, this is still one truly beautiful, sexy beast of a folding door system. Oh yeah,